So was the Iranian nuclear program obliterated, like President Trump said, or not? I mean, we're starting to get some pushback here in the United States from the Defense Intelligence Agency, as their preliminary assessment appears to contradict initial reporting. Now, to dig into that today, we're going to be taking a look at U.S. and Iranian media, as well as a statement from the IAEA and statements from U.S. and Israeli officials, and then a couple scenarios on what this could mean. Now, the reason this is so important is that while the execution of this mission, Operation Midnight Hammer, was no doubt incredible. I mean, secretly penetrating Iranian airspace and then dropping bombs exactly on target is wildly impressive and an awesome display of American military might. But if the nuclear facilities weren't destroyed or at least severely damaged, then the stated objective wasn't met. And that could mean that we, the United States, or Israel might be looking to do this again sometime in the near future. And of course, the possibility is that Iran learns from this experience to make a follow-on strike that much more challenging. So to start with the whole battle damage assessment view today, and we are going to be taking a look at some new satellite imagery, President Trump, right as the strikes were announced, said that the underground facilities were completely destroyed. They were obliterated. And he's sticking with that. Just yesterday, said, quote, "The nuclear sites in Iran are completely destroyed." Now, we knew this was a challenge from the get-go. They're deeply buried, 200 to 300 feet at some points, maybe deeper at Fordo, and it's always been a question as to whether or not these U.S. bunker buster GBU-57 bombs had the capability of effectively penetrating far enough down to fully destroy these structures. So this isn't crazy that there's questions being raised as to the effectiveness of these strikes. And as mentioned in previous videos, if you look at the satellite imagery here, we just don't have a lot to go off of. There's some holes in the ground. Now, fortunately, we do have some experts that have dug into it a little bit further, but the bottom line is we have no idea at this point what it looks like inside of that facility, which makes it notable then that we're starting to get some assessments from inside the U.S. intelligence community pushing back on this and saying the damage might not be as severe as initially thought. Now, this first one here that we're really starting to see spread is being reported by CNN. And a couple notes I want to make here, and they make clear right out the gate that this is an early assessment. This same story is being reported in the Associated Press, Reuters, Washington Post, and New York Times, and probably a few others at this point. From my read of all of those different organizations, they are all going off of the same source material. So these aren't different reports. All they're really doing is validating that that initial source said what they said. So keep that in mind. But nonetheless, let's start with the CNN report saying that the strikes were not as effective as initially claimed.
Yeah, look, Brianna, this is the first assessment that we are getting that the U.S. intelligence community has found about the battle damage that resulted from those U.S. military strikes on these 3 Iranian nuclear facilities over the weekend. And as you said, it was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's intelligence arm. And it is worth noting that it is a very early assessment. The strikes were only a matter of days ago, and the intelligence community is still gathering intelligence. They are still working to come up with a full, comprehensive picture of what exactly happened here. But based on a battle damage assessment that was carried out by U.S. Central Command, essentially looking at the images and looking at what was actually damaged, the Defense Intelligence Agency has assessed that the core components of Iran's nuclear program are largely intact, and that Iran's nuclear program has essentially only been set back by months.
So, of course, that's been a concern anytime we talk about using military force to take out the Iranian nuclear program is what if you don't actually take everything out? So it should not be shocking at all that there is some pushback in that direction, some skepticism. Another key note here is she's talking about how this is the early assessment, the first assessment of the battle damage assessed here. Now, if you're thinking of the best way to approach a problem set like this, rationally, it seems like the best way to go forward is to assume that nothing was damaged and work up from there as the evidence presents itself. If you were to go into this, the intelligence analysts, and myself never having been an intel analyst for what it's worth, if you go in with the assumption that everything went perfectly according to plan and everything is 100% destroyed, and you get it wrong because there's no additional information, that's probably a bad place to start. So it seems like the safe starting point is no damage until proved otherwise. And for some of the above ground facilities, there's clearly a lot of damage. Like buildings were there, they're not there anymore. So it's much easier to assess damage at places like Isfahan and Natanz, where entire structures have just been completely eliminated. Now, in this same CNN report, they did push on an interesting item here that has also been a topic of debate leading up to the strikes, is whether or not these munitions would actually work. These GBU-57s, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs, massive ordnance penetrators, they had not been used in an operational setting before. weapons are not perfect. They malfunction. They don't work as designed. And sometimes the target isn't what you think it is. So that's an important piece that, again, there was a lot of reporting across different outlets before the strikes took place questioning this. Do we know if this munition can actually get the job done? Which led some into the wild speculation of using nuclear weapons, was how intense this conversation was. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and give that a quick listen.
It is worth noting here that there has been dissent, I should say, within the intelligence community, within the defense community, about just how much of an impact these massive bunker buster bombs would actually have on Iran's nuclear facilities. It was far from certain, given that these bombs had never been tested in an actual combat scenario, whether they would actually penetrate those very, very deep underground tunnels that lie underneath these nuclear facilities. And what we are told is that as of now, this Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, it does conclude at this point, again, it is still very early, that those underground facilities, including the centrifuges, including the highly enriched uranium that everyone has been talking so much about, those are largely intact. Now, of course, this does stand at odds with what President Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth have been saying in recent days about the impact of these U.S. military strikes. Of course, President Trump said it was totally obliterated. All
right, so a couple things to keep in mind here with the initial CNN story. First off, unnamed sources, right? Anytime that happens, there's always a little bit of cold water thrown on the accusation. This is also the first assessment that we've heard anything about. We're probably going to get upwards of 20 different organizations looking at the battle damage assessment here to make their determination. This could be the only one that says this, or it might be the first. So we have no idea. We're at this point, this is being, from all we can tell, cherry-picked, one organization. There's also the possibility that this is a politically motivated leak. This is getting into like DC politics stuff. Fortunately, I've never been a part of that. But in reading through some of the other assessments, folks are talking about how quickly this came out could point to political motivation. And the interesting part there is it could be politically motivated in a bunch of different directions. That doesn't necessarily mean, as you'll hear Secretary Hegseth and the White House press secretary speak to here in a moment, that this was leaked to discredit the president and say that he did not do what he actually said he did. But it also could be pushed out there to try to get the United States and or Israel to continue strikes against Iran, saying, hey, this problem is not resolved. We can't just walk away and assume that we're good to go, because there are plenty of people in the United States, some with quite a bit of power and a lot of influence over President Trump, that were very upset with the ceasefire announcement and want to see a continuation of hostilities against Iran until probably some sort of regime change. The last piece when looking at the CNN assessment is there's no new public information. Like maybe something was shared with these reporters. They didn't make that public. It was just the assessment that was made public. So at this point, we are, all of us out here, still kind of operating off of the same set of facts. Now, turning to some responses here, which CNN did include in their reporting. I'm kind of breaking out separately for the ease of this video. Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokesperson, put out a statement saying, quote, "Fake news CNN strikes again. This alleged assessment is flat out wrong and was classified as top secret, but was still leaked to CNN by an anonymous, low-level loser in the intelligence community. The leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs directly on their targets, total obliteration." So I don't love a lot of that. I don't like the accusation that this is meant to demean the pilots. I've not seen that from any direction at all. From all accounts, and I want to stress this, the pilots did their jobs wonderfully. The air crews were exceptional here, carried out a mission that not everyone necessarily thought could be done just a few short days ago. And whether or not those munitions achieve their desired effects on target, it takes away nothing from what our brave men and women in uniform did the other day. Now, Secretary Hegseth also pushed back on this claim. He's at the NATO summit right now. In an interview with the Secretary General and President Trump, they were asked a question about the effects of this strike. Let's give that a listen.
Pete, do you have something to say about that?
Well, Mr. President, when you talk to the people who built the bombs, understand what those bombs can do, and deliver those bombs, they landed precisely where they were supposed to, so it's a flawless mission.
Flawless.
Right down where we knew they needed to enter, and given the 30,000 pounds of explosives and capability of those munitions, it was devastation underneath Fordo. And the amount of munitions, 6 per location, any assessment that tells you it was something otherwise is speculating with other motives. And we know that because when you actually look at the report, by the way, it was a top secret report, it was preliminary, it was low confidence. All right, so this isn't, you make assessments based on what you know. They
And
don't.
it said it could be very devastating, very serious.
Moderate
in
to
that
severe,
report.
and we believe far more likely severe and obliterated.
Is there
So
a
this
leak
is political
investigation?
motive here.
Is there a leak investigation?
Of course, we're doing a leak investigation with the FBI right now because this information is for internal purposes, battle damage assessments, and CNN and others are trying to spin it to make the president look bad when this was an overwhelming success.
We had a
All right, so a couple key takeaways there from Secretary Hegseth. First off, I believe that's the first time we've heard that this assessment was listed as low confidence. That's important to know. That might be based off of the lack of information available so far. Again, they might just be looking at the satellite imagery that we have at this point. Probably a little nicer than what we have, but nonetheless, it is notable there if it is also a low confidence assessment. One pushback here is a lot of bombs. They're kind of leaning on the fact that a lot of firepower was used. And I just want to stress that a lot of firepower does not automatically translate to desired effects on target. A little personal story. In Afghanistan, more than once, we dropped 500-pound bombs on Taliban fighters relatively in the open, and they ran away. I don't know if they ended up dying shortly thereafter. Maybe the overpressure got them or something like that. But you cannot just assume that a big bomb on a target does what you think it's going to do. Explosives are weird. Things happen that you don't expect to happen. Sometimes they don't detonate as intended. Sometimes the blast goes in a strange little direction. Other times they, in this case, maybe they didn't penetrate as deeply as desired. So, the quantity of munitions does not, look at World War II. The quantity of munitions dropped on portions of Germany during that war and didn't always achieve the desired effect. So quantity of munitions, size of the boom does not automatically mean mission success. Another key note here, and this is one that's just kind of playing into the speculation, I don't know that you can do much with it, is my understanding is yesterday a congressional closed-door briefing on the battle damage assessment was canceled. Now, it could be canceled for any number of reasons, but there are some looking at that saying, well, it's only canceled because they don't have good news to share, or the battle damage assessment is not what we initially thought it was. Again, that speculation is going in that direction. It could also be that, as we see, we've got the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the President overseas at NATO right now. So maybe they wanted more principals stateside for that briefing. Nonetheless, I want to continue on with the Israeli assessment from what we know so far. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech after the ceasefire was announced yesterday where he said, quote, "We rose like a lion and we roared a shook Tehran. This war will be studied by militaries around the world. We destroyed the key facilities at Iraq, Natanz, and Isfahan. The underground enrichment site in Fordo was destroyed. We obliterated Iran's entire nuclear archive. We brought Iran's nuclear project to ruin. If anyone thinks of trying again, we will strike again." That's about the most assessment I've seen from Israel officially at this point. There have also been some leaks talking about how Israeli officials are skeptical that everything was destroyed. But again, I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of publicly available information beyond just the satellite imagery. Now, we did get what I would say is probably the most in-depth assessment of these strikes so far yesterday, put out by the Institute for Science and International Security, or the unfortunately acronym ISIS study. I feel like they got to change that, right? You got to, at some point, just redirect that URL, come up with something else. That's years ago. That probably should have been changed, right? But nonetheless, we got some satellite imagery here they ran through, starting with Natanz. Again, a couple differences between these few facilities. I'm only going to focus on here the underground facilities because we can pretty clearly see what happened at Isfahan. I'll put up some imagery here to show that. Buildings were there, buildings are no longer there. And there's some underground facilities all across Iran, but the deep ones that were necessary for the U.S. to use these GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators were at Natanz. Apparently there was one aspect there, and then certainly at Fordo. So that's what we're going to look at here. They say in regards to the Natanz nuclear complex, satellite imagery shows at least one penetration hole located above the buried enrichment hall caused by a GBU-57 bunker buster. It is reported by the U.S. Department of Defense that at least 2 GBU-57s attacked the site, possibly in an attack where one followed the other through the same penetration hole in a double-tap strike. As a result, the site is likely destroyed and knocked out of operation. No damage was observed in satellite imagery of the complex being constructed underneath Mount Kolag Gaz La. And then shifting over to Fordo, where they went much further in depth, and again, some satellite imagery here to share. They say the United States dropped 12 MOPs over the deeply buried enrichment halls. High-resolution satellite imagery taken post-attack shows 2 groups of 3 penetration holes on the mountain above the enrichment halls. This set of holes are the location of the ventilation shaft of the underground complex and at the location of the previously identified service-related structures that lay above the Cascade Hall, enabling easier pathway for the MOPs to the deeply buried halls. As a result, the facility is likely severely damaged or destroyed. It appears that the bombing was precisely targeted to concentrate on 2 likely points of vulnerability, evident from both the available plot plans and the complex's features observed during construction on historical satellite imagery publicly available on Google Earth. The first point target is what can generally be termed as a ventilation shaft, but is likely a more elaborate structure, which connects subsurface with a central hallway leading to the 2 main underground halls shown in the plot plan, housing both equipment and centrifuges. Interestingly, the bomb blast waves that would have been generated down the 2 halls from these 2 points of attack run perpendicular to one another, further increasing the likelihood of maximum damage and destruction. So I thought this was great, showing the overlay, showing exactly where the bombs are expected to have hit, why those locations were important. An interesting thing that I feel like is getting lost in a lot of this is we're pretty sure that's what the facility looks like underground, but this is based off of some captured documents the Mossad captured a while back. As far as I know, there's no ground-penetrating radar that's been able to successfully map that facility. So we think that's probably what it is, which just adds in another dynamic of confusion when trying to assess how effective were these strikes actually. Now, one key component here that seems like everybody is kind of on board with is there is still uranium, highly enriched uranium, that is missing. I mean, Vice President Vance hinted at this the other day and just said, essentially, what he said was, yes, that's out there, but if they don't have the ability to go from 60 to 90, we've destroyed all the facilities and it's not as much of a risk, which no doubt is true. But I do want to stress that enriched uranium is still floating around out there somewhere. And we got a clip talking to that from the IAEA Director General Grossi on Fox News yesterday saying, yeah, we don't know exactly where that is.
I have to be very precise, Martha. I have to be very, very precise.
Of course.
We are the IAEA, so we are not speculating here. We do not have information of the whereabouts of this material. So this is why I'm asking, we are making an assumption, which is not a speculative or pure speculation, because Iran officially told me we are going to be taking protective measures, which may or may not include moving around this material.
So a couple notes there. First off, I do want to stress Grossi. It was a longer interview, and they were really pressing Grossi to try to give his assessment on if the facilities were destroyed or not. And I think he did a great job. He's like, look, I'm an inspector. I'm not, he didn't say this directly, but my takeaway was, I'm not an intel analyst or anything. Like, I don't have sources on the ground that are like describing the destruction. He said, I can only go based off of what I see, and we need to get on the ground in there. So I like that he wasn't going in a direction of saying definitely destroyed or definitely not destroyed, because he's kind of sitting where most of us are. Nonetheless, he does make clear that there's probably some enriched uranium floating around Iran somewhere. And as we've spoken to in recent videos, Iran has said as much, that they're going to do that. In fact, turning to some statements from Iran, Tasnim News reported yesterday that the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said arrangements have been made to prevent any disruption to their nuclear activities. He said the AEOI has taken all necessary measures and is assessing damages in sites that have been attacked. Iran had made a series of arrangements in advance to restore the nuclear activities, highlighting plans that may have been devised to prevent any hiatus in the process and production and services of the nuclear industry. Again, that is something that we heard the moment that Israeli bombs started hitting, was Iran saying, cool, we're going to start moving things around, or we have already moved things around. Now, the Tehran Times, this is both of these are IRGC affiliated, very close. I don't know if I would necessarily say state-run, state-affiliated media, so keep that in mind. The Tehran Times, in giving an explanation of how this war played out from their perspective and how this is being relayed inside of Iran, which fits when you see some celebrations in the streets, they say the war between Iran and Israel appeared to grind to a halt on Tuesday after a dizzying 12 days in which the world watched President Donald Trump demand the evacuation of Tehran's 10 million residents, threaten to assassinate Iran's leader, advocate for regime change, launch strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, and then claim he harbored no beef with the Iranian government and even wish for God to bless Iran. So to nobody's surprise, really, a lot of Iranian media right now is celebrating this as a victory. They outlasted. They kind of the way they're putting it is, hey, Israel was being beat down, so they had to ask for the United States to come in, and the U.S. started to hit us, and then we hit their base in Qatar, and that was too much for them, so they asked for a ceasefire. That's the Iranian version of events. But more relevant to today's video, the Tehran Times says, quote, Iran managed to relocate its enriched uranium stored at Fordo to a secure location before the American strike. Satellite imagery, expert analysis, and statements from Iranian authorities indicate that the vast majority of Iran's underground facilities remain intact, although some surface damage was sustained. If Iran decides to pursue nuclear weapons in the future, it would almost certainly be a direct result of the Israeli-American war imposed on it while diplomatic efforts were underway. Some surface damage was sustained is a light way of putting it. Again, let's take a look at Isfahan, maybe. Like, it seems like half of the above-ground facilities don't exist anymore. So, yes, there was definitely some above-ground damage sustained, but I thought it was worth getting into how Iran is presenting this as well. And for what it's worth, they've been pretty consistent in saying that exact same thing, which leads us into I'm going to break this out very broadly into two scenarios to keep in mind here, because I think either one of these technically are possible, and they might be kind of the extremes in both directions. So scenario one is kind of simple and straightforward, and it's the idea that everything that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have laid out, the facilities are completely destroyed. There's nothing left. There's even, if you want to add to that, there's some speculation that Iran thought Fordo was impenetrable. So ahead of these strikes, they actually moved additional centrifuges and other things, highly sensitive materials and technology to Fordo to protect it, which, if that's the case, better than we originally thought, right? Maybe we actually destroyed the one place where they had consolidated and had hidden everything. The argument here would be that Iran is pushing back, saying that everything is fine because that's what you would do in order to save face, and nothing can be definitively proven otherwise. The leaked assessment in that case, you would probably have to view as mostly political or based exclusively on early data that will be disproven or changed over time. However, even with that generally best case scenario, we do still appear to not know where the enriched uranium is floating around Iran. So that is kind of the wild card here. Now, the second scenario, a little more messy, a lot more complex, and it's the idea here that the underground facilities were damaged, no doubt damaged, right? Again, even if these bunker busters only went halfway down what they were supposed to and still detonated, there's going to be a lot of damage inside of those facilities, but maybe not destroyed. And this is especially looking at Fordo. And I want to be clear that the above ground stuff, we can tell what's destroyed. So there's no debating that damage. It's the underground stuff that we're not clear on quite yet. In this scenario, it's possible that the materials and some equipment were moved out ahead of time. So instead of Iran looking at Fordo and saying this is impenetrable, move everything there, they might have looked at that and said it's not worth risking, move it to some secret offsite facilities, which Iran has done in the past. We know that. I mean, Fordo was a secret facility that the U.S., Israel, and the IAEA didn't even know about for years. So I wouldn't put it past them that they had some other facilities we don't know about, and they've been stockpiling things there because they've been worried about this kind of strike. That argument would then play into the telegraphed and all things considered, a pretty weak response after the U.S. hit the nuclear facilities because, hey, maybe they don't need an overwhelming response if nothing was significantly damaged. They just need to find a way for the U.S. to say, we did it. Now let's find an off-ramp. Let's negotiate a ceasefire. And that ceasefire gets Israel out of their airspace. I mean, they've been getting hunted day in and day out by the Israeli Air Force. And it allows Iran to, through these secret facilities and maybe their enriched uranium that is, again, somewhere around the country, continue their nuclear program and arguably speed it up. And this is where this second scenario has the possibility of having made things worse. If we went after the known nuclear facilities, destroyed or not, and Iran still has some unknown facilities and or equipment that they moved to these new locations, they might be driven now to pursue a nuclear weapon faster, thinking that if they have one, what just happened in the last 12 days won't happen next time. So nonetheless, we are starting to get some push in multiple directions right now about the effects of the U.S. strikes, Operation Midnight Hammer, against the Iranian infrastructure. Personally, I feel like there's enough information out there to where it's still really a matter of who do you trust, who do you believe, what does your gut say, because we're basing it off of the same satellite imagery we had day one. So hopefully we get more detailed assessments, more information soon, because unfortunately this is starting to turn, from what I see, into more and more of a partisan political fight, and that's not helpful because this is a national security issue. And It's not a matter of making Trump look good or bad. It's a matter of, does Iran have a nuclear program, and are they continuing to build said program? So either way, hopefully more information on that front soon. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.